Blissful Ignorance. The Yoga of Unknowing. Working definition of intelligence. A person who utilizes a variety of tools with which to solve a problem or puzzle or a conundrum within a relatively short period of time. Working definition of the Yoga of Unknowing. The word yoga is a Sanskrit term derived from yuj, which has been variously translated as working together, binding together, or connecting together. Thus, the Yoga of Unknowing is a way of uniting with that feeling of mystery, that sense of infinite luminosity, which is the natural state of all humans who are seeking to know. Nicholas of Cusa, the 15th century Roman Catholic cardinal and polymath, realized a profound truth in his studies, which he codified at the age of 39 in a remarkable Latin text entitled Deducta Ignorantia. Although well versed in the science and theology of his day, Nicholas of Cusa understood that no matter how much knowledge he gained from reading or experience or contemplation, it would be infinitely lacking in comparison to what would remain to be known. His main thesis has an ironic import. To become educated is to learn how ignorant one really is. In today's vernacular, it can be stated as thusly: we are ultimately a stupid species, and the more we realize this truth, the smarter we can become. I think if we're honest to ourselves, we have an acute awareness of our limitations. Yes, we may be knowledgeable or competent in certain areas, whether it be in fixing a car, a meal, or a mathematical equation. But in a host of other fields, we find ourselves floundering in our own incompetence. This, of course, is not surprising and should be expected. But what we too often fail to realize is that even in our chosen specialties, there remains much we cannot comprehend. Given the restrictions of our cranial capacities and the boundaries of our physiological anatomies, operating as they do within a circumscribed environmental niche, it is transparently obvious that no matter how much information we can acquire in a lifetime, it will be infinitesimal in its comparative range. Therefore, is it not the height of human folly to believe, even for a nanosecond, that our models of the universe describe reality as it is? Even though we have a tremendous advantage over other animals in trying to explain our place in the world around us, the fact remains that the limits of our language use are to a large measure the limits of how we perceive. To bastardize a famous Wittgenstein insight from his book Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. Thomas Gray, an English poet from the 18th century, once penned, "Where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise." Today, in the 21st century, his phrase, "ignorance is bliss," has become widely used and is usually translated to mean, if you do not know about something, you do not worry about it. Each of us can recall occasions where we seemed relatively happy and at peace, only to be sunk into sorrow on learning that a loved one was injured in an accident, or, worse, died unexpectedly. Here, we wish that the tragedy never happened, and thus we could live as we did before. But such is not life. However, there is also a deeper wisdom in the phrase, "ignorance is bliss," if it is capitalized and positioned differently. That is when we realize, along with Nicholas of Cusa, Socrates, Lao Tzu, Fakir Chand, and other notables, that acknowledging our unknowingness is the cornerstone to becoming wise. As Richard Feynman, the distinguished Nobel Prize-winning physicist, simply put it, I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong. I don't feel frightened not knowing things, by being lost in a mysterious universe. The original sin of humankind is not that the mythological beings Adam and Eve ate fruit from the tree of knowledge, but that we've invariably confused our neurology, our state of mind, for ontology, the real state of being, and thus consistently get tricked into believing that the maps we generate are the territory itself. Everything we mentally and intellectually generate to understand the universe we inhabit is defined by our neuronal architecture. Yes, we know much, but we never know all, and therein lies the secret. Socrates, according to Plato's account, was regarded as the wisest man in Greece, precisely because he was acutely aware that he was ultimately unknowing. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy provides us with a nice summary and background behind this realization. In Plato's Apology, Socrates and his friend Chaerephon visit the oracle at Delphi. As the story goes, Chaerephon asks the oracle whether anyone is wiser than Socrates. The oracle's answer is that Socrates is the wisest person. Socrates reports that he's puzzled by this answer, since so many other people in the community are well known for their extensive knowledge and wisdom, and yet Socrates claims that he lacks knowledge and wisdom. Socrates does an investigation to get to the bottom of this puzzle. He interrogates a series of politicians, poets, and craftsmen. As one would expect, Socrates' investigation reveals that those who claim to have knowledge either do not really know any of the things they claim to know, or else know far less than they proclaim to know. The most knowledgeable of the bunch, the craftsmen, know about their craft, but they claim to know things far beyond the scope of their expertise. Socrates, so we're told, neither suffers the vice of claiming to know things he does not know, nor the vice of claiming to have wisdom when he does not have wisdom. This not-knowing outlook has been described by Sharon Ryan as wisdom as epistemic humility. Nicholas of Cusa, writing centuries after Plato, explains it further. Both the precise combinations in corporeal things as the congruent relating of known to unknown surpass reason to such an extent that Socrates seemed to himself to know nothing except that he did not know. And the very wise Solomon maintained that all things are difficult and unexplainable in words. And a certain other man of divine spirit says that wisdom and the seat of understanding are hidden from the eyes of all the living. Even the very profound Aristotle, in his first philosophy, asserts that in things most obvious by nature, such difficulty occurs for us as for a night owl which is trying to look at the sun. Therefore, if the foregoing points are true, then since the desire in us is not in vain, assuredly we desire to know that we do not know. If we can attain unto this, knowledge of our ignorance, we will attain unto learned ignorance. For a man, even one very well versed in learning, will attain unto nothing more perfect than to be found to be most learned in the ignorance which is distinctively his. The more he knows that he is unknowing, the more learned he will be. Even the mystically inclined, such as Fakir Chand from 1886 to 1981, though a master meditator for over 70 years, came to the profound realization that despite all of his elevated experiences in samadhi, confessed, "Who knows what may happen to me at the time of my death? I may enter the state of unconsciousness, enter the state of dreams, and see railway trains. How can I make a claim about my attainment of the ultimate? The truth is that I know nothing." At first understanding, our native ignorance that no matter how much knowledge we gain in our life, or lifetimes, depending on your theological bent, will allow us full and 360-degree access to the deepest secrets of the multiverse can be disconcerting. But it can also be liberating if seen in the right light. How so? Instead of presuming at each turn that we're in possession of how the world really works, we can open ourselves up to the obvious fact that we still have much to learn. By doing this, we consciously seek new avenues of information, and thus, our monologues become dialogues. Our inviolate dogmas become partial contributions, and our resistance to being wrong turns to opportunities to change our mind. We move from unbending certainty to evolving uncertainty. Science, of course, is predicated upon this unknowing foundation, And that's why it's become such a successful and progressive enterprise, and why orthodox religions have tended to never alter course, even when their cherished myths have turned out to be less than accurate. The Yoga of Unknowing. I bring all this up as a necessary preface for practicing a yoga of unknowing. We've all done this discipline before, even if not consistently, and even if unconsciously. When we were quite young, say 2 to 4, the world we inhabited was filled with unfathomable mysteries. I remember my friends and I wondering where all the water and clouds came from, how rainbows appeared, and why worms seemed to come out of nowhere after it rained. A television was a magical box. Hummingbirds were divine creatures, and sparkling stars fueled our imagination. But we grew up, and some of the magic went away when we started to know the name of things, mistakenly assuming that such labeling meant that we actually knew more about it than we did. Yet, even the simplest of objects holds secrets that remain hidden from our view. As the poet Alfred Tennyson majestically wrote in 1863, "Flower in the crannied wall, I pluck you out of all the crannies. I hold you here, root and all, in my hand. Little flower, but if I could understand what you are, root and all in all, I should know what God and man is." The flower is physics, history, biology, math, and more, all bundled up in a single gesture of nature. To fully understand all that it represents is indeed to grasp the infinite subtlety that prefigures life itself. But wholly grasp it we cannot, except as tiny granules of much greater mosaic. In the very moment we think we know something, we realize anew that we've only touched a sliver of what's possible to be known. Niels Bohr, Einstein's longtime friend and intellectual foiling partner, understood this well when he introduced the concept of complementarity in order to grapple with the paradoxical nature of quantum mechanics. For instance, measure with confidence the momentum of an electron, and the less certain will be your measurement of its position, and vice versa. It's as if nature were a cosmic tease, where one part is revealed and the other remains concealed. The quantum realm is a game of hide and seek, with the bewitching roadblock that nothing is fully uncovered. There is a deep lesson here that, when properly implemented, can change our approach to education and indeed to how we relate to all those we know. The belief that we know something is often a form of clutching, a contraction, and a barrier from opening ourselves up to learning more, or worse, to admitting that we may be mistaken, partly or wholly, in our understanding. The knowledge claim can be a wall of our own creation that we find impossible to scale, despite that we erected it ourselves. Think of our current politics and the immense disconnect we feel on each side about the other's point of view. Think of religion, old and new, and how many devotees feel that they have the truth, whereas other faiths are either hell-bent or destined for another round on the wheel of samsara. Now think of the current virus pandemic. Watch how differing views take up arms, both literally and figuratively, to champion their position. It is truly ironic that when we know very little, we think and act like we know much. This is the lot of humankind, and this is our sad history from time immemorial. The Yoga of Unknowing offers a pathway beyond this, and it doesn't have to be taught. No teachers or gurus or masters are needed. It just necessitates acknowledging moment to moment what we already intuit to be the case. We are not very smart. Yes, to be sure, we may be quite competent in some specific areas, but in other realms, we remain dutifully oblivious to what is happening. There is a wonderful bliss that can be had when we remain within that realm of not knowing, where we don't push our particular model as the be-all and end-all. When we open ourselves to counter ideas and counter information, even when we're secure in our ideational thinking, we relax at the core of our beings and find that our channels of communication are cleared of unnecessary static. As a teacher for the past 40 years, I'm keenly aware of the hazards that are inherent in my profession. We, so-called philosophers, are supposed to be the professors of knowledge, sprouting forth pearls of wisdom. But there's always a student who will know something we don't, or who can pose a question that goes beyond our expertise. How we respond in those moments reveals much. I know from which I speak because there have been several occasions in my career where I found myself reacting in ways that were counterproductive. It was when I came off flat-footed, or, more embarrassingly, when I put that same foot in my mouth, that it dawned on me that students learn more when one is transparently honest about their limitations than with striking an unnatural pose of knowingness, particularly when it's clear to be a sham. So, how does the Yoga of Unknowing work in practical terms? First, it starts with the feeling of letting go of any absolute pretensions. By relaxing into the space of, I don't know much, and that will always be the case, then one sinks into that sense of mystery, which is our natural condition. We came into the world not knowing, and we will leave the world not knowing. The famous line from Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat underlines this perfectly. Myself when young did eagerly frequent doctor and saint, and heard great argument about it and about, but evermore came out by the same door as in I went. If we're ever in doubt about how little we know, any object will disabuse us of our arrogance. What is a piece of paper, ultimately? A hierarchy of information, which includes a tree, wood, molecules, atoms, neurons, electrons, all the way down to what Sir Arthur Eddington opined was, something unknown is doing what don't know. Everything is not what it seems. If we can melt into the integrated mystery, then we imbibe that sense of awe that we had as children before we grew up thinking we knew something when we didn't. The Yoga of Unknowing does have a very revealing caveat. While I'm confident that I don't ultimately know, I cannot then absolutely assume that nobody else does either, since that would indicate I knew more than I actually did. Sam Keen posits it in his own inimitable way when he ponders, I think we have to trust ourselves in the darkness of not knowing. The God out of which we came and into which we go is an unknown God. It's the luminosity of that darkness and that unknowing that is, I think, the most human, and the most sacred, place of all. A drop in the ocean doesn't know the vast expanse, except to the degree that it's part of it, and is sustained by it. It's as if we're all on a tall Himalayan peak looking through a telescope and seeing 1,000,000 stars in the night sky. We continually tinker with our magnifying apparatus, and each time it improves, we see yet even more stars. Where once there was just 1,000,000, now there are 1,000,000,000, 1,000,000,000,000, and so on. Such is our knowledge. The more we know, the more there is to learn. Infinity is never encompassed by that which is finite. This is why Nicholas of Cusa uses geometry as a means to understand learned ignorance, when he posits, the circle cannot be squared, since the area of a circle is incommensurable with that of any non-circle. But these are just analogies, and all the intellectual jostling we do are less persuasive than the very feeling we get when confronted with our stupidity. How does this unknowing gut sense help us? It frees us from our own conceit, the hubris that we are possessors of hidden keys to the universe that others lack. No, we are all dumb, blind, and mute in the face of the immeasurable vastness of space and time. The Yoga of Unknowing is a way of waking up to what Rudolf Otto termed Ganz andere and Mysterium Tremendum, where the numinous is all-pervasive and yet wholly other, since any vessel that tries to contain it is ultimately shattered. We are those vessels, and the more we understand our limitations, what Nicholas of Cusa called our ignorance, the wiser we become as a result. The mystic mathematician also developed a unique koan, which in itself is worthy of repeated contemplation. The unattainable is attained through its unattainment. Semyon Lyudvigovich Frank, the distinguished Russian philosopher, has provided us with perhaps the clearest articulation of Cusa's philosophy in his book, The Unknowable, wherein he states that human knowledge does not exhaust what remains to be known in the cosmos. Indeed, that is why we have progressive forms of knowledge, and why science advances. Although there is no literary evidence that Isaac Newton said the following, it does nicely sum up our intellectual endeavors. I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have only been like a boy playing on the seashore, and diverting myself now and then in finding a smoother pebble or prettier shell than ordinary, while the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me. On the other side of the globe, the famous Zen koan concerning tea is illustrative here, and comports nicely with the Yoga of Unknowing. Nanin served tea. He poured his visitor's cup full, and then kept on pouring. The professor watched the overflow until he no longer could restrain himself. It is overfull. No more will go in. Like this cup, Nanin said, you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup? The Mystery of the Eight Realms. A Journey to Base Reality. My wife Andrea and I had the privilege this last week to be plenary speakers at the Second International Conference on Dialogue Science of Consciousness, which was jointly sponsored by the University of Waterloo in Canada. Because of the current pandemic, the entire conference was conducted on the internet by utilizing Zoom and YouTube. This allowed for a diverse range of speakers from around the globe, including talks from Japan, Germany, Canada, India, and America. There were a number of distinguished presenters, including Professor Peter H. Rowe, University of Waterloo, who served as co-chair, Dr. Anirban Bandyopadhyay, senior scientist at the National Institute for Materials Science, NIMS, Tsukuba, Japan, Professor Elizabeth Behrman, Wichita State University, Professor Rocco Gennaro, University of Southern Indiana, Professor Anna Horacek, Kiel University, Germany, Professor Wolfgang J. Duschel, Kiel University, Germany, Professor Keith Heipel, University Professor of Systems Design Engineering at the University of Waterloo, and my longtime friend and mentor, Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Global Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. The guiding light and co-chair of the entire conference was Professor Prem Saran Satsangi, who is the current spiritual leader of the Radhswami Dayalbag Satsang, headquartered in Agra, India. He gave the Vision Talk, which focused on an evolutionary and scientific science of consciousness. The Dayalbag Educational Institute has been on the leading edge of promoting a more scientific and rational understanding of higher-order mysticism through the systematic practice of Suryat Shab Yoga, as developed and defined by the original founder of Radhswami, Shiv Dayal Singh. They have created and sponsored a number of conferences and panels during the last decade. My wife and I have been fortunate to have been invited to 3 prior events in Agra, India, in 2010, 2014, and 2018. In each of them, with the exception of 2018, we concentrated our efforts in championing a more physicalist understanding of how consciousness arises within the limited contours of the brain. My wife Andrea's recent presentation, which was also published as a small book, was entitled A Many-Sided Brain: The Jain Approach to Studying Consciousness. which pointed out that 3 key giant concepts were elemental for doing science objectively. These are, accordingly, anekantavada, many-sidedness, sayadvada, uncertainty, and ahimsa, nonviolence. It was quite well received and gave a unique perspective about how an ancient religion's core values can dovetail almost seamlessly with today's current scientific outlook. My own talk was a bit more futuristic, since it centered on how virtual reality technology can offer a promising portal into how human consciousness evolved by providing us with a technical understanding of visual latency and rendering. It has also been published as a small book, along with a short film to highlight the inner workings of how VR headsets, such as the Oculus Quest, work. There were several comments made by the attendees after my talk and later from those who watched the recast of it on YouTube. However, the most valuable insights were provided to me both verbally and in writing from the spiritual leader of Radha Swami at Dayalbagh, Professor Prem Saran Satsangi. Although we at first appeared at loggerheads over the issue of what virtual reality could offer the study of consciousness, Professor Saran Satsangi touched upon a related issue that I realized almost immediately needed further analysis. This is, in essence, whether or not humans can, through interior exploration, what those connected with Dayalbagh have termed as an ultra-transcendental deepest meditation technique, of their own subjective awareness and accessing higher and higher levels of consciousness, actually move beyond mere appearances and ascertain the fundamental core of reality. In my paper, I argued that what makes virtual reality so appealing is that it can trick us into believing a simulation is lifelike, even though it is the result of intertwining a sophisticated hardware headset with complex software engineering. If such an artificial device can convince us that it's as real as the world we see around us, it updates Plato's famous allegory of the cave and raises the ever-present Kantian question of whether we perceive things in themselves or only their appearance. In computational terms, we can understand this by looking at our smartphones and how they operate. For the vast majority of us, we only know about the phone's user interface where we pinch and swipe at various applications on the screen. But we remain ignorant about the underlying programming code that allows such displays, and we know even less about the infinitesimally small circuit chips that electronically power it. Donald Hoffman, professor of cognitive science at the University of California, Irvine, believes that a radical new approach is needed to understand the emergence of self-awareness, since evolution has shaped us with perceptions that allow us to survive, but part of that involves hiding from us the stuff we don't need to know, and that's pretty much all of reality, whatever reality might be. Hoffman suggests that with the desktop interface, we have, for the first time, the appropriate metaphor to understand how something that looks real on the surface is anything but, as he has elaborated in several lectures and in his books. Suppose there's a blue rectangular icon on the lower right corner of your computer's desktop. Does that mean that the file itself is blue and rectangular and lives in the lower right corner of your computer? Of course not. But those are the only things that can be asserted about anything on the desktop. It has color, position, and shape. Those are the only categories available to you, and yet none of them are true about the file itself or anything in the computer. They couldn't possibly be true. That's an interesting thing. You could not form a true description of the innards of the computer if your entire view of reality was confined to the desktop. And yet the desktop is useful. That blue rectangular icon guides my behavior, and it hides a complex reality that I don't need to know. That's the key idea. Evolution has shaped us with perceptions that allow us to survive. They guide adaptive behaviors, but part of that involves hiding from the stuff we don't need to know. And that's pretty much all of reality, whatever reality might be. If you had to spend all that time figuring it out, the tiger would eat you. In other words, our own awareness is not a transparency about how reality works as such, but what is sufficient for us to survive long enough to transfer our genetic code before dying. Because of this, we are like informational Luddites who don't see the nuts and bolts behind how our neural anatomies function. As I detailed in my book, The Virtual Reality of Consciousness, in trying to understand consciousness, differing models have been proposed over the years by scientists and philosophers, ranging from variations of Cartesian dualism, mind is primary, body is merely a vehicle, to neural correlate theory. Mind is the brain and arises due to complex interactions. Realizing that all models, no matter how sophisticated, will fall short to some measure, the key is to utilize ones that provide us with newfound insights and hitherto unknown predictive powers. The advent of virtual and augmented reality may serve as a useful pathway to better understand why consciousness evolved the way it did. Primarily because the brain itself operates as a VR system, albeit a much more sophisticated one than Oculus Rift or HTC Vive. Everything we've ever experienced is modified by our central nervous system. Our brain refashions the world we see, hear, touch, and smell by transfiguring incoming data points, light, sound, etc., into chemical electrical signals that are reconstructed via our elaborate neural net into the world we apprehend around us. We never experience the exterior cosmos as it is, but only as our own biologically evolved VR headsets reconceive it. Whenever I use an Oculus-related device, from Rift to Go to the Quest, I'm always amazed by how such a headgear with 6 degrees of freedom and a 1440 by 1600 per eye resolution makes me feel as if I've entered into a new world, and all of this with a device that weighs less than a pound. VR is a trickster, since by its software and hardware design one responds as if the images that arrive have a sort of independent reality apart from its technology. Yet, it is that very technology which is creating the illusion that what I perceive is trans-machine-like. Immanuel Kant and others following his lead turned philosophy on its head by redirecting our focus back to the limits of our cranial capacity, and how such a limitation, in turn, invariably confuses the questions we ask about the universe at large. In the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein refined this even more by showing how language itself is a culprit in our pursuit of philosophical inquiries, since the words we use are contextual and do not lend themselves to atomic purity. To his great credit, Wittgenstein realized the error of his ways years later, after gallantly attempting to first clear out the cobwebs of faulty language usage in his groundbreaking book, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. Language is a game, and how we play it depends on a number of contingent factors, not the least of which is on our prior agreed-upon assumptions. Today, with the ever-growing successes in neuroscience, we have entered a new world of understanding how the brain works and how it evolved not so much to understand the world at large, in some ultimate ontological sense, but rather how best to survive within it. Virtual reality provides us with an instructive portal by which to better grasp how the brain develops elaborate simulations that help us better navigate future possibilities. So, the real question that Professor Prem Saran Satsangi has raised, and one which is at the heart of all mysticism, is whether we can, like Plato's prisoners in the allegory of the cave, see the real light that is behind all shadows and appearances. Can we, in other words, penetrate the user interface and behold the subterranean levels which encode the applications we employ? Or does meditation merely uncover a hierarchy of surfaces that never penetrates to the Kantian thing in itself? It is undoubtedly a profound question, and one which ancient Greek philosophers also grappled with. Today, we confront the same conundrum in the sciences, such as astrophysics, quantum mechanics, and neuroscience, which are trying to pull the curtain behind the images we see and probe deep into the elemental core of what constitutes the infinitely large and the infinitely small. It is intriguing to note that the founder of Radhaswami, Shiv Dayal Singh, also developed a sophisticated schema in which he too, like Plato and Kant before him, realized that what we take to be reality is but a beguiling maya, an illusion which betrays its primal origination. Indeed, the whole philosophy of Radhaswami is predicated on the Gnostic idea that there are higher levels of consciousness, and that, at this lower level of awareness, we remain ignorant of the universe's greater grand design. It was for this very reason that Shiv Dayal Singh and the various gurus that followed in his lineage have advocated a specific form of meditation which allows one to access higher and higher regions of consciousness. The ultimate goal is to achieve liberation from the physical, astral, and causal sheaths that blind and bound us from truly realizing our true nature. In Sant Mat and Radhaswami theology, depending on which branch one is affiliated with, there are anywhere from 5 to 8 to 12 regions that one has to traverse in order to achieve moksha, or final enlightenment. In his famous poem Hidayatnama, Shiv Dayal Singh elaborates on 5 major stages. Each includes and transcends the lower realm. When your eye turns inwards in the brain and you see the firmament within, and your spirit leaves the body and rises upwards, you will see the Akash, in which is located Sahasdal Kanwal, the 1,000 petals of which perform the various functions pertaining to the 3 worlds. Its effulgence will exhilarate your spirit. You will, at that stage, witness Niranjan, the Lord of 3 worlds. Several religions which attained this stage and took the deity thereof to be the Lord of all were duped. Seeing the light and refulgence of this region, they felt satiated. Their upward progress was stopped. They did not find the guide to higher regions. Hence, they could not proceed further. Notice how Shiv Dayal Singh argues that those who access the first region, known as Sahasdal Kanwal, believe that they have attained the highest stage possible. This is a mistake, and he claimed that several religions, and their respective founders, he would later point out, were duped when they took the Lord of this 3 worlds to the Supreme Being. Indeed, all the regions below the 5th, Sakhkhand, are illusory. And if one doesn't have a fully realized guide who has transcended to the highest, then one is apt to get entrapped and satiated with the lower worlds. This entire cosmology, regardless of its theological overlay, suggests that the higher one ascends, the closer one gets to reality or God itself. One is moving away from Plato's shadows and entering into the light directly. Whether this is actually true or not is, of course, a question that's open to vigorous debate. The Radhaswami tradition wants to argue that only by Shabd Yoga meditation can one go beyond the physical, astral, and causal interfaces and beyond the true essence of all that exists. Tulsi Sahib of Hathras and the acknowledged guru to Shiv Dayal Singh's parents has described this inner access with an intriguing metaphor when he writes in Gat Ramayana, "The soul hears a wave of sound and rhythm and opens the door unspeakable, indescribable. Going beyond rhythm and sight, one enters the gate of the tower of emptiness. Then one sees the sound current issuing forth hundreds of thousands of universes, and sound penetrates to the middle of them all, their crown jewel, which is tiny as an insect." What is intriguing about this particular poetic metaphor is that Tulsi Sahib suggests that the underlying secret of the cosmos emerges not from something extraordinarily large, but rather that which is tiny as an insect. It's only by following the Shabd through its various subtle iterations that one can penetrate beyond the veil and see the true origin of all that arises. This, as we've mentioned, is an ancient insight, even if the methods to acquire the true gnosis differs across various disciplines, whether religious or scientific. The reason I believe that virtual, augmented, and mixed realities are so instructive here is that they provide such a vivid encompassment that eerily parallels how our own brains construct the reality we see around us. But that reality, as science has shown for the last 400 years, is merely topographical and does not in itself reveal the inner workings of why the sky appears blue, or why diseases are caused by unseen germs, or why it takes 8 minutes for the sun's light to reach our eyes, or that we are traveling 60,000 miles plus per hour orbiting the sun, even if everything seems relatively still. In sum, we are, in a bracketed way, prisoners of our brain's evolution and what it deems necessary for our temporary survival. We don't see things as they are in some ultimate ontological sense, but we catch only slivers of what is possible. This reminds one anew of the famous 1999 movie, The Matrix, where Morpheus wants to offer Neo the chance to plunge deeper and go beyond the glistening surface and understand how what he experiences is but a deception. But Morpheus realizes that he must give Neo the option to choose, so he offers him a blue pill and a red pill. If Neo takes the blue one, he goes no farther and he stays at the user interface. If he takes the red one, he goes deeper and, like Alice in Wonderland, goes down the proverbial rabbit hole. Analogously, we are in the same position as Neo, except that there's an ongoing debate about what truly constitutes the red pill. The Dayalbag leader, Prem Saran Satsangi, has argued that Radhaswami, as originally taught by Shiv Dayal Singh, offers a more complete understanding of reality than other methods, when he writes, "Every religion has its own philosophy and preaches it at different levels of the hierarchy of consciousness, but Radhaswami faith is all-embracing and is the only faith providing understanding and access to ultimate reality and its fountainhead, Nij Dham Radhaswami." Eastern saints experienced it, but these experiences are not a part of physical reality. Virtual reality is a part of physical reality of body and mind, and this has no access to pure spirituality. Researchers would often mention this as pure thought, which can be interpreted as the entry point of pure spirituality. My argument is not that virtual reality accesses pure spirituality, but rather provides us with a detailed and useful model for how our brains construct reality, and thereby providing us with a window into our own self-awareness can so easily be duped by sophisticated hardware and software engineering. Understanding how VR does this provides us with the necessary tools to see how consciousness may have evolved over eons of time, and in the process, hidden from our view how it performs such a magical act. The red pill, in this instance, is a scientific one, since it forces us to realize how we conflate our neurology for ontology, or, in computational terms, why our present user interface is constructed not to reveal reality as such, but to conceal it for our own evolutionary benefit. Now, mysticism also offers a red pill. It argues along similar lines to the external sciences, and may, indeed, utilize VR as an instructive lesson in this regard, but posits an internal quest via one's own consciousness as the modus operandi to liberate oneself from Maya and the delusions of the present limited frame of reality. Naturally, science and mysticism don't have to be mutually exclusive, even if at first glance they may seem like strange bedfellows. But the persistent epistemic question is whether our deeper probes, scientifically or mystically oriented, truly get to the core architecture of the universe's true operating system. For example, a programmer's view of a computer is quite different than one who merely uses it for email or social networking or watching TikTok videos. The programmer sees increasing levels of abstraction from digital logic, at its base, to microarchitecture, to instruction set architecture, to the operating system, to assembly language, to application programs of high-level language. And what is most important to remember here is that each level hides the details of the level below. And this is why most of us have no clue about how certain technologies truly function and operate. Arthur C. Clarke's famous 3 laws are instructive here. 1. When a distinguished but elderly scientist states that something is possible, he is almost certainly right. When he states that something is impossible, he is very probably wrong. 2. The only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. 3. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. We live in Clarke's magical realm, and this is why I believe VR, AR, and MR are so important in unraveling the mystery of consciousness, since we get a first-hand glimpse of how certain technical tools can mimic the world we take to be so real. Simply put, the mystery of consciousness is a technical one. Not that VR in itself reveals the truth, far from it, but that it illustrates so well how our own brains are nothing more than synthetic simulators par excellence. Therefore, when we're having our first-person experiences in consciousness, we tend never to doubt what we see, hear, touch, and feel, since it has a Clarke-like magic to it, even though it's the result of millions of years of nature's never-ending selective process. Clarke's second law, pushing beyond what we think is possible, is how science progresses. It's also, mystics would argue, how we can get access to higher states of consciousness beyond the rational mind. We have to push the boundaries of the conventional to gain entry into that which remains unknown. I'm not arguing that virtual reality and mysticism are the same. No, I am suggesting that VR is a tool for us to understand how consciousness itself, which has been jerry-rigged in ways that are inaccessible to us. Just like those of us who use our smartphone but have no clue about its inner workings. But the sticking point, once again, and this is why it deserves repeating, is epistemological. Does meditation genuinely get us beyond digital logic, to stay with our computer programming metaphor, and directly penetrate the electron realm? Or does mysticism only peel back layers so far, and even then, never touch the elemental base? Masters in the Radhaswami tradition truly believe that Shabd Yoga meditation, as taught by its founder Shiv Dayal Singh, does indeed unravel the mystery of consciousness, and are not in the least shy about proclaiming such. Those skeptical of mystical claims, such as Patricia Churchland, Daniel Dennett, Brian Greene, and countless others, are not so convinced. Although I am a great advocate of meditation, particularly of the Shabd Yoga variety, I am agnostic about the truth claims that are made in the name of mysticism and spirituality, knowing too well how easy it is for humans to be conceived into confusing an image for a real object or conflating an effect for a cause. We don't seem equipped to be truth detectors in the absolute sense, though it does seem entirely reasonable to take Arthur C. Clarke's second law seriously and plunge beyond what we think we know. Ironically, I think we can learn a fundamental lesson from Shiv Dayal Singh's cautionary poem Hidenama, which is much more skeptical than one might at first suspect, especially when he writes, "Seeing the light and refulgence of this region, they felt satiated. Their upward progress was stopped. They did not find the guide to higher regions. Hence, they could not proceed further." Shiv Dayal Singh is giving a warning shot across the bow to all would-be meditators. Don't be deceived by what at first appears to be the final destination. Rather, carry on and go beyond what satiates you and what entrances you. How can we continue on our voyage into the deeper recesses of consciousness itself? By doubting what arises and transcending what appears to be true. This is the core of the scientific method, and this, I believe, is the real message that too often gets lost in Shiv Dayal Singh's instructions. Whether we will get to the base reality is unknown, but the good news is that we can learn much in the unraveling process. Virtual reality is our current technological touchstone, which shows us that the secret to consciousness is not in how it appears and how it seems certain, but rather that it hides a much deeper secret about its own construction. Our job, whether we be mystics or scientists, is to learn the lesson VR, AR, and MR offers us, and be like Neo and swallow the red pill, or like Toto in The Wizard of Oz, who pulls the curtain, or like Alice in Wonderland, and drop down the rabbit hole. To realize that what appears magical isn't, and not to be entrapped by simulations of our own making. The wise sage from Hoshiarpur, though he never donned a VR headset, understood intimately that visions of so-called reality are not in themselves real. Fakir Chand realized that even the most fantastic of internal experiences can be illusory and machinations of one's own mind, even if we have no clue about their construction. Likewise, the great lesson for both the scientist and the mystic is a cautionary one. Don't succumb too eagerly or too easily to the transcendental temptation. Shiv Dayal Singh's poetry in Sarbachan can be read in two ways, each of which are complementary. Explore the deep recesses of your own being via the inner sound current, but at the same time be wary of accepting any experience, or interpretation of that experience, as the final one. Yes, it is good to be mystically oriented in exploring the depths of our own consciousness, but we should also be highly skeptical of what arises and what it all means. The science of meditation, I would suggest, is an exploratory one at this stage, and making any final adjudications is not necessary and premature. On Learned Ignorance. Nicholas of Cusa. 1. For the naturalists state that the certain unpleasant sensation in the opening of the stomach precedes the appetite in order that, having been stimulated in this way, the nature, which endeavors to preserve itself, will replenish itself. By comparison, I consider wondering, on whose account there is philosophizing, to precede the desire for knowing, in order that the intellect, whose understanding is its being, will perfect itself by the study of truth. Unusual things, even if they be monstrous, are accustomed to move us. For this reason, zero unparalleled teacher, deem, according to your kindness, that something worthwhile lies hidden therein. And in regard to divine matters, receive from a German a mode of reasoning such as the following, a mode which great labor has rendered very pleasing to me. 2. However, all those who make an investigation judge the uncertain proportionally, by means of a comparison with what is taken to be certain. Therefore, every inquiry is comparative and uses the means of comparative relation. Now, when the things investigated are able to be compared by means of a close proportional tracing back to what is taken to be certain, our judgment apprehends easily. But when we need many intermediate steps, difficulty arises and hard work is required. These points are recognized in mathematics, where the earlier propositions are quite easily traced back to the first and most evident principles, but where later propositions are traced back with more difficulty because they are traced back only through the meditation of the earlier ones. Therefore, every inquiry proceeds by means of a comparative relation, whether an easy or difficult one. Hence, the infinite, qua infinite, is known, for it escapes all comparative relation. 3. But since comparative relation indicates an agreement in some one respect and, at the same time, indicates an otherness, it cannot be understood independently of number. Accordingly, number encompasses all things related comparatively. Therefore, number, which is a necessary condition of comparative relation, is present not only in quantity, but also in all things which in any manner whatsoever can agree or differ either substantially or accidentally. Perhaps for this reason Pythagoras deemed all things to be constituted and understood through the power of numbers. Both the precise combinations in corporeal things and the congruent relating of known to unknown surpass human reason to such an extent that Socrates seemed to himself to know nothing except that he did not know. And the very wise Solomon maintained that all things are difficult and inexplainable in words. 4. And a certain other man of divine spirit says that wisdom and the seat of understanding are hidden from the eyes of all the living. Even the very profound Aristotle, in his first philosophy, asserts that in things most obvious by nature, such difficulty occurs for us as for a night owl which is trying to look at the sun. Therefore, if the foregoing points are true, then since the desire in us is not in vain, assuredly we desire to know that we do not know. If we can fully attain unto this knowledge of our ignorance, we will attain unto learned ignorance. For a man, even one very well versed in learning, will attain unto nothing more perfect than to be found to be most learned in the ignorance which is distinctively his. The more he knows that he is unknowing, the more learned he will be. Unto this end I have undertaken the task of writing a few things about learned ignorance. 5. Since I am going to discuss the maximum learning of ignorance, I must deal with the nature of maximality. Now, I give the name maximum to that than which there cannot be anything greater. But fullness befits what is one. Thus, oneness, which is also being, coincides with maximality. But if such oneness is altogether free from all relation and contraction, obviously nothing is opposed to it, since it is absolute maximality. Thus, the maximum is the absolute one which is all things, and all things are in the maximum, for it is the maximum. And since nothing is opposed to it, the minimum likewise coincides with it, and hence the maximum is also in all things. And because it is absolute, it is, actually, every possible being. It contracts nothing from things, all of which derive from it. In the first book, I shall strive to investigate incomprehensibly above human reason this maximum, which the faith of all nations indubitably believes to be God. I shall investigate, with the guidance of Him who alone dwells in inaccessible light. 6. Secondly, just as absolute maximality is absolute being, through which all things are that which they are, so from absolute being there exists a universal oneness of being which is spoken of as a maximum deriving from the absolute maximum, existing from it contractedly and as a universe. This maximum's oneness is contracted in plurality, and it cannot exist without plurality. Indeed, in its universal oneness, this maximum encompasses all things, so that all the things which derive from the absolute maximum are in this maximum, and this maximum is in all these things. Nevertheless, it does not exist independently of the plurality in which it's present, for it does not exist without contraction, from which it cannot be freed. In the second book, I will add a few points about this maximum, viz., the universe. Thirdly, a maximum of a third sort will thereafter be exhibited, for since the universe exists in plurality, only contractedly, we shall seek among the many things the one maximum in which the universe actually exists most greatly and most perfectly as in its goal. 7. Now, such a maximum is united with the absolute maximum, which is the universal end. It is united because it is a most perfect goal, which surpasses our every capability. However, someone who desires to grasp the meaning must elevate his intellect above the import of the words rather than insisting upon the proper significations of words which cannot be properly adapted to such great intellectual mysteries. Moreover, it is necessary to use the guiding illustrations in a transcendent way and to leave behind perceptible things so that the reader may readily ascend into simple intellectuality. I have endeavored, for the purpose of investigating this pathway, to explain matters to those of ordinary intelligence as clearly as I could. Avoiding all roughness of style, I show at the outset that learned ignorance has its basis in the fact that the precise truth is inapprehensible. 8. It is self-evident that there is no comparative relation of the infinite to the finite. Therefore, it is most clear that where we find comparative degrees of greatness, we do not arrive at the unqualifiedly maximum. For things which are comparatively greater and lesser are finite, but, necessarily, such a maximum is infinite. Therefore, if anything is posited which is not the unqualifiedly maximum, it is evident that something greater can be posited. And since we find degrees of equality, so that one thing is more equal to a second thing than to a third, in accordance with generic, specific, spatial, causal, and temporal agreement and difference among similar things, obviously, we cannot find two or more things which are so similar and equal that they could not be progressively more similar ad infinitum. Hence, the measure and the measured, however equal they are, will always remain different. Therefore, it is not the case that by means of likenesses, a finite intellect can precisely attain the truth about things. For truth is not something more or something less, but is something indivisible. 9. Whatever is not truth cannot measure truth precisely. By comparison, a non-circle cannot measure a circle, whose being is something indivisible. Hence, the intellect, which is not truth, never comprehends truth so precisely that truth cannot be comprehended infinitely more precisely. For the intellect is to truth as an inscribed polygon is to the inscribing circle. The more angles the inscribed polygon has, the more similar it is to the circle. However, even if the number of its angles is increased ad infinitum, the polygon never becomes equal to the circle unless it's resolved into an identity with the circle. Hence, regarding truth, it is evident that we do not know anything other than the following, viz., that we know truth not to be precisely comprehensible as it is. For truth may be likened unto the most absolute necessity, which cannot be either something more or something less than it is, and our intellect may be likened unto possibility. Therefore, the quiddity of things which is the truth of beings is unattainable in its purity. Though it's sought by all philosophers, it's found by no one as it is, and the more deeply we're instructed in this ignorance, the closer we approach to truth. 10. The absolute maximum with which the minimum coincides is understood incomprehensibly, since the unqualifiedly and absolutely maximum, than which there cannot be a greater, is greater than we can comprehend, because it is infinite truth. We attain unto it in no other way than incomprehensibly. For since it is not the nature of those things which can be comparatively greater and lesser, it is beyond all that we can conceive. For whatsoever things are apprehended by the senses, by reason or by intellect, differ both within themselves and in relation to one another, differ in such way that there is no precise equality among them. Therefore, maximum equality, which is neither other than nor different from anything, surpasses all understanding. Hence, since the absolutely maximum is all that which can be, it is altogether actual. And just as there cannot be a greater, so for the same reason there cannot be a lesser, since it is all that which can be. But the minimum is that than which there cannot be a lesser. And since the maximum is also such, it is evident that the minimum coincides with the maximum. The foregoing point will become clearer to you if you contract maximum and minimum to quantity. For maximum quantity is maximally large, and minimum quantity is maximally small. Therefore, if you free maximum and minimum from quantity by mentally removing large and small, you will see clearly that maximum and minimum coincide. For maximum is a superlative just as minimum is a superlative. Therefore, it's not the case that absolute quantity is maximum quantity rather than minimum quantity, for in it the minimum is the maximum coincidingly. 11. Therefore, opposing features belong only to those things which can be comparatively greater and lesser. They befit these things in different ways, but they do not at all befit the absolutely maximum, since it is beyond all opposition. Therefore, because the absolutely maximum is absolutely and actually all things which can be, and is so free of all opposition that the minimum coincides with it, it is beyond both all affirmation and all negation. And it is not, as well as is, all that which is conceived to be, and it is, as well as is not, all that which is conceived not to be. But it is a given thing in such way that it is all things, and it is all things in such way that it is no thing, and it is maximally a given thing in such way that it is minimally. For example, to say, God, who is absolute maximality, is light, is to say no other than, God is maximally light in such way that he is minimally light. For absolute maximality could not be actually all possible things unless it were infinite and were the boundary of all things, and were unable to be bounded by any of those things. As by the graciousness of God, I will explain in subsequent sections. However, the absolutely maximum transcends all our understanding. For our intellect cannot, by means of reasoning, combine contradictories in their beginning, since we proceed by means of what nature makes evident to us. Our reason falls far short of this infinite power, and is unable to connect contradictories, which are infinitely distant. Therefore, we see incomprehensibly beyond all rational inference that absolute maximality, to which nothing is opposed and with which the minimum coincides, is infinite. But maximum and minimum, as used in this first book, are transcendent terms of absolute signification, so that in their absolute simplicity they encompass, beyond all contraction to quantity of mass or quantity of power, all things. 12. From these considerations, it's most clearly evident that the absolutely maximum is both incomprehensibly understandable and unnamably nameable. Anything, then, which a greater or a lesser cannot be posited, cannot be named. For by the movement of our reason, names are assigned to things which, in terms of comparative relation, can be comparatively greater or lesser, and since all things exist in the best way they are able to exist, there cannot be a plurality of beings independently of number. For if number is removed, the distinctness, order, comparative relation, and harmony of things cease, and the very plurality of beings ceases. But if number itself were infinite, in which case it would be actually maximal and the minimum would coincide with it, all of these things would likewise cease, since to be infinite number and to be minimally number, i.e., not at all to be number, amount to the same thing. Therefore, if in ascending the scale of numbers we actually arrive at the maximum number, since number is finite, still we do not come to a maximum number than which there can be no greater number, for such a number would be infinite. Therefore, it is evident that the ascending number scale is actually finite, and that the arrived at maximum number would be in potentially relative to another greater number. But if on the descending scale a similar thing held true of a number, so that for any actually posited small number, a smaller number were always positable by subtraction, just as on the ascending scale a larger number is always positable by addition, then the outcome would still be the same, as in the case where number were infinite. For there would be no distinction of things, nor would any order or any plurality or any degrees of comparatively greater and lesser be found among numbers. Indeed, there would not be a number. Therefore, in numbering, it is necessary to come to a minimum than which there cannot be a lesser, viz., oneness. And since there cannot be anything lesser than oneness, oneness will be an unqualifiedly minimum, which, by virtue of the considerations just presented, coincides with the maximum. 13. However, oneness cannot be number, for number, which can be comparatively greater, cannot at all be either an unqualifiedly minimum or an unqualifiedly maximum. Rather, oneness is the beginning of all number, because it is the minimum, and it is the end of all number, because it is the maximum. Therefore, by comparison, absolute oneness, to which nothing is opposed, is absolute maximality, which is the blessed God. Since this oneness is maximal, it cannot be multiple, for it is all that which can be. Therefore, it cannot become number. See that by means of number we have been led to understanding, 1. That absolute oneness quite closely befits the unnameable God, and 2. That God is so one that He is, actually, everything which is possible. Accordingly, absolute oneness cannot be comparatively greater or lesser, nor can it be multiple. Thus, deity is infinite oneness. Therefore, the quiddity of things, which is the truth of beings, is unattainable in its purity. Though it is sought by all philosophers, it is found by no one as it is. And the more deeply we are instructed in this ignorance, the closer we approach to truth. Nicholas of Cusa, On Learned Ignorance.